I was 54 years old when people who grew up alongside me laughed in my face, simply because I decided to start over from scratch in the United States. They said I was going to clean strangers' houses and come back defeated. And for a while, that was exactly what happened. I worked as a housekeeper, alone, exhausted, invisible, while everyone thought my story had already ended there. But what nobody saw was what I did after my shift, the quiet choices, the sacrifices, and one decision that started to change everything. And that's when the same people who laughed began reaching out to me, desperate to understand how I managed to turn things around. I still remember the day I decided to leave. It wasn't a beautiful moment, like something out of a movie, with an inspiring soundtrack and tearful goodbyes. It was quiet, heavy, almost suffocating. I was 54 years old, born and raised in Jaipur, and for the first time in my life, I was choosing something just for myself, without asking for permission, without waiting for anyone's approval. And perhaps that was exactly what bothered people the most. When I started telling people I was moving to the United States, the reactions weren't supportive. They were laughter, first disguised, then open, wide open. Some people covered their mouths pretending to be shocked, but their eyes gave away the mockery. Others didn't even bother pretending. At your age, Anita, what are you going to do there? Become a housekeeper? Do you really think there's still time for you? I heard all of it, from neighbors, from acquaintances, even from relatives, people who grew up with me, who had eaten at my table, who knew my whole story. And even so, they laughed, as if I were telling a joke. At first I tried to defend myself. I said I wanted to start over, that I still had dreams, that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life looking out the window wondering, what if? But after a while I stopped explaining. It was pointless. Those who have already decided to laugh at you don't want to understand. They want to be proven right. So I left. No farewell party, no applause, just a suitcase, some dollars saved over years, and a fear I had never felt before. When the plane took off, I didn't cry. But when it landed, I almost gave up, because that's when reality began. Nothing was the way I had imagined. The language felt faster, harsher. People had no time. Everything was urgent, automatic, distant. I felt invisible, and at the same time completely exposed. In the first few days, I stayed at the home of a distant acquaintance, a small shared room with a makeshift bed. I didn't complain. I knew it was only the beginning, but the beginning was harder than I expected. Finding work wasn't easy. My age was a disadvantage, my limited English too, and above all, the way people looked at me, as if I were someone whose time had already passed, until an opportunity came along. Cleaning, American homes, exactly like they had predicted. I remember the first day. I woke up before sunrise, put on simple clothes, tied my hair back, and stood for a few minutes looking at my reflection in the mirror. It wasn't shame, but it wasn't pride either. It was a strange feeling, hard to explain. I thought about everything people had said about me, about all the laughter, about every comment. She'll end up as a housekeeper. And there I was, becoming exactly what they had used to diminish me. The work was grueling, far more than I had imagined. Large houses, full of details, staircases, carpets, bathrooms. Everything had to be spotless. There was no room for error. My hands ached, my back burned. There were days I came home and could barely get out of bed. But the physical exhaustion wasn't the worst part. It was the loneliness. Spending the entire day cleaning other people's houses, overhearing conversations that weren't mine, watching lives that felt worlds away from my own reality, and then returning to a quiet room with no one to talk to, no one to ask how my day went. I began to understand what it truly means to start over. It's not just changing locations. It's losing your bearings. It's rebuilding your identity from scratch. It's accepting that you'll be seen as less before you get any chance to prove otherwise. And for a while, I accepted that, because it was either that or give up, and I had not crossed an ocean to come back defeated. But what nobody knew, what nobody saw, was what happened after I got home. Because my day didn't end when I put down the cleaning supplies. In fact, that's when another part began. A quiet part, invisible, exhausting in a different way, while everyone who laughed at me thought my story had ended there. Scrubbing floors, cleaning bathrooms, living a small life. I was making choices, small ones at first, almost imperceptible, but that, little by little, began to change everything. And nobody noticed. Nobody, except me. I didn't tell anyone what I did after work. Not the person I shared the room with, not the few people who occasionally asked if I was settling in. I simply said everything was fine, but it wasn't. I came home exhausted, my hands still smelling of cleaning products, my body heavy, my mind full, and even so, I didn't allow myself to truly rest. I would sit on the bed, pick up my old phone, which froze more than it worked, and begin. First, English. I realized within the first few days that it wasn't just a difficulty. It was a wall. Not understanding, not being able to respond, not being able to follow a simple conversation. It always put me one step behind, so I started with what I had. I watched videos with subtitles. I repeated phrases quietly to myself. I wrote words down in a small notebook I kept in my cleaning bag. Sometimes, while cleaning an enormous kitchen, I would mentally rehearse how to say simple things like, "May I use this?" or "I'm done in here." It seemed like very little, but it wasn't, because gradually I began to notice changes, small victories that nobody saw. One day, I understood an entire sentence without needing to translate it. The next, I managed to respond to something without freezing up. And that gave me a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. Progress. But English was only the beginning. There was one day that changed everything, even though in the moment I didn't realize it. I was cleaning a woman's house, a large, organized home with a soft scent of scented candles that lingered in the air. She was almost never there, but that day she was working from home. I did my work in silence, as always, but at one point, while cleaning the living room, I heard her on a video call. She spoke with confidence, she shared opinions, she made decisions, and somehow she seemed light. It wasn't just what she was saying, it was how she lived, and that made me think. It wasn't envy, it was a different kind of discomfort, as if a part of me woke up and said, "There is more than this." That day when I got home, I didn't just open English videos. I started searching for other things, how people earn money here, how jobs outside of cleaning work, what someone like me could do. And being honest, at first it was frightening. It felt like a world too far away, terms I didn't understand, different systems, ways of making money that had never been part of my reality. But one thing became clear to me. Nobody was going to come and teach me. Nobody was going to hand me a shortcut. If I wanted to get out of there, I would have to learn on my own. And that's when I started making choices that nobody saw. While other people in the same job used their little free time to rest, and rightfully so, because the exhaustion was real, I began dividing my time. One part to survive, another to get out of that life. I started saving seriously. It was no longer just keeping what was left over. It was deciding before spending. I stopped buying small things that had previously seemed necessary. Every dollar began to carry a different weight, because for the first time, I wasn't just paying bills. I was building something, slowly, in silence, without telling anyone. There were nights I wanted to give up, many. There were days I thought they were right, because it's hard to keep going when nobody believes in you, and even harder when you start doubting yourself. But there was something inside me that wouldn't let me stop. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the fear of going back and having to look into the eyes of all those who had laughed. I didn't want to prove anything to them, but I also didn't want to confirm what they said. So I kept going, learning little by little, making many mistakes, trying to understand how that country worked, a country that, in the beginning, seemed to have no space for me. And it was through that process that something began to change, not on the outside, on the inside. I no longer felt so small. I was still a housekeeper, I still cleaned homes, I still came back tired. But my mind was no longer in the same place. I started observing more. The houses I cleaned stopped being just work. They became lessons. I paid attention to the details, to the habits, to the way people organized their lives. I noticed patterns, I noticed opportunities, and most importantly, I began to understand value. The value of time, the value of effort, the value of knowing something that other people don't. And that's when the first idea came. Simple, almost silly, but that, somehow, lit something inside me. Something I didn't yet know, But that would be the beginning of everything. The idea seemed too small to change anything in my life. If someone had asked me in that moment, I would have said myself that nothing would come of it. But even so, I didn't ignore it. It all started with something I was already doing every day: cleaning. Only this time, I began looking at it differently. I noticed that many of the homes I cleaned had patterns, not just in how they were organized, but in what they needed. Some clients always asked for extra attention in certain areas. Others complained about specific things. And there were those who, even with a spotless house, still seemed unsatisfied, as if something were missing. At first, I didn't understand what it was, until gradually I began to see. It wasn't just about cleaning. It was about detail. It was about care. It was about something beyond the basics. Most people who worked alongside me did the job correctly, quickly, efficiently, without mistakes. But almost nobody did something extra. Nobody truly observed the environment, the family's lifestyle, what might make their daily lives easier. And that's where my mind started working differently. I began testing small things, nothing that drew attention, nothing that seemed too bold, but enough to be noticed. There was a day when I quietly reorganized the kitchen counter of one of my clients. I didn't move anything abruptly. I just grouped the items better, made the space more functional, more open. The next day, when I returned, she mentioned it. "I don't know what you did, but it feels better in here." That stayed with me. Another day, I folded the towels differently, more neatly, the way I had seen in a video. A small detail, almost nothing. But the reaction was bigger than I expected, and without realizing it, I began creating my own signature. While others cleaned, I observed, adjusted, improved. And over time, that began to generate something I hadn't expected so soon: trust. Some clients started requesting that I come back more often. Others began mentioning my name to friends. And, for the first time since I had arrived in that country, something changed. I stopped being just another housekeeper. I started being Anita. But even so, I didn't tell anyone. Not those who had laughed at me. Not those who pretended to be interested. Because I knew it was still early. Very early. I still cleaned houses. I still earned little. I still lived simply. But on the inside, something was already different. I began to understand that the problem was never the work itself. The problem was how I saw it. When I saw it as an ending, it truly was small. But when I began to see it as a beginning, everything changed. And it was during this phase that I made a decision that, looking back today, was a true turning point. I stopped accepting any job that came my way. At first, this seemed crazy. I needed money. Every opportunity made a difference. Turning down work didn't seem smart, but I began to notice that some jobs were pulling me down. Clients who didn't appreciate the work, difficult environments, pay too low for the effort required. So scared as I was, I began to choose, little by little, prioritizing places where I was respected, where there was room to do more than the bare minimum. And something curious happened. I started earning more, working less. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't easy. There were tight weeks. There were moments of doubt. But little by little, things began to balance out. And alongside that, something else began to grow: my courage. Because when you realize you can change small things, you start to believe you can change bigger ones. And that's exactly what happened. I started thinking beyond. What if I could have my own clients? What if I no longer depended on someone else to refer me? What if I could charge for the value of my work, rather than just accepting what was offered? These questions began following me every day. And once again, I didn't tell anyone, because it still felt like a distant dream. But this time, different from before, I didn't ignore it. I started preparing, quietly, learning more about how people find clients, observing how advertisements worked, trying to understand how to present myself better. And it was through that process, full of trial and error, that I took the first step that truly moved me away from the place where everyone thought I would stay. A simple step, but one that, in that moment, felt enormous. The first step was far from perfect. Actually, it wasn't even close. I had no experience with marketing. I didn't really understand how advertisements worked, and I certainly didn't know how to sell myself. All of it was too new for me. But even so, I decided to try. With the help of simple tutorials and a lot of trial and error, I created a listing, nothing sophisticated, basic text, a few simple photos, which I took myself, carefully, trying to show the quality of my work. I reviewed that listing dozens of times, afraid of writing something wrong, afraid of looking amateurish, afraid that nobody would respond. And deep down, I was also afraid of the opposite, afraid of it actually working. Because if it worked, I'd have no more excuses. I posted it, and I waited. On the first day, nothing. On the second, silence. On the third, I started thinking it had been a waste of time. That old voice came back. You weren't born for this. Stick to what's safe. But on the fourth day, a message arrived. Short, direct, asking about the price. I remember staring at my phone for several minutes before responding. My heart raced as if it were something huge. And in a way, it was. I didn't know how much to charge. Charge too little, and I'd stay in the same place. Charge too much, and I might lose the opportunity. So I did something that, to this day, I consider one of the most important decisions I ever made. I charged what I believed my work was worth, not out of fear, not out of insecurity, based on value. I sent the message and waited for the reply. It took a while, hours. I thought I had lost it. But by the end of the day, she replied, "That works. When can you come?" In that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't about the money. It was about the confirmation. I could do this. The first job I landed on my own was different from everything I had done before. Not because the house was bigger or harder, but because, for the first time, I wasn't there because someone had referred me. I was there because someone had chosen me. And that brought a different kind of responsibility. I prepared more carefully. I paid even more attention to detail. I gave everything I had, not just to do the job well, but to create an experience. When I finished, I didn't know if it had been enough. But the next day, she sent another message. She wanted to book again. And not only that, she said she was going to refer me to a friend. That's how it started. Slowly. One client, then two, then three. No explosion, no overnight success, but consistent. And without realizing it, I had begun building something that nobody believed I was capable of. Over time, I no longer depended on the jobs I used to accept out of necessity. I had my own clients, my own rhythm, my own rules. And it was during this phase that something curious began to happen. People started to notice, not at the beginning, not when I was still fighting in silence, but when the signs began to appear. A nicer outfit here, a different place there, a photo in a more beautiful setting. Small things, but enough to spark curiosity. And with the curiosity came the messages. First timid ones. "Hi, Anita. It's been so long. I saw you're in the United States. How are things going?" Then more direct ones. "Are you still working in cleaning? Can you actually make good money doing that?" And finally, the ones that caught my attention the most. "How did you do it?" Some of those messages came from exactly the people who had laughed at me. I recognized the names. I remembered the voices, the expressions, the comments. And that was strange. It didn't bring revenge. It didn't bring anger. But it brought clarity, because I realized something that completely changed the way I saw everything. People don't laugh because they know more. They laugh because they can't see beyond. And in that moment, they were starting to see. But even so, they were only seeing the surface. They saw the photos, the places, the appearance of a better life, but they didn't see what had truly happened. The exhausting nights, the difficult choices, the days I almost gave up, and most importantly, they didn't see the quiet decisions that made all the difference. And that's when I understood something that very few people grasp. The result draws attention, but it's the process that transforms. And my process hadn't ended. In fact, it was only just beginning to take a larger shape, because it was at that moment, when I was no longer just surviving, but starting to grow, that an opportunity appeared that I had never considered before. Something that, if it worked, would change everything for good. The opportunity appeared unexpectedly, the way almost everything that truly changes our lives does. It didn't come as a formal proposal, nor as a brilliant idea. It came in a simple conversation, one that, had I not been paying attention, would have passed me by entirely. I was finishing up at a new client's home. She had been referred by someone else, and from the beginning I sensed she was different. Not just in the way she spoke, but in the way she observed everything around her. When I finished, she did something that very few people had done. She asked, but not about price, not about availability. She asked about me. How long have you been doing this? Did you always work in cleaning? Do you work alone? I answered honestly, but without going into too much detail. There was still in me that habit of not exposing myself too much, of not telling my full story. She listened to everything carefully, and then said something that, in that moment, I didn't fully understand. You don't work as a housekeeper. You organize lives. I smiled, not quite knowing how to respond. To me, it was still just work, but to her, it seemed like something more. Before I left, she mentioned that she knew other people who needed exactly that kind of care. Not just cleaning, but someone who would bring order, lightness, and functionality. I thanked her, without building any expectation. I had already learned not to depend on promises, but this time, it was different. She kept her word. The following week, 2 new clients reached out to me, then another, and there was something they all had in common. They didn't just want someone to clean. They wanted someone they could trust, someone who could care for their space as if it were their own. And without realizing it, I began to occupy a place that wasn't common. I stopped being seen as someone who executes tasks and became someone who delivers transformation. That changed everything. It changed the way I charged. It changed the way I positioned myself. It changed, most importantly, the way I saw myself. Because until then, even with all the progress, there was still an old voice inside me saying, "You're just a housekeeper." And slowly, that voice began losing its strength. I started organizing my schedule better. I no longer accepted last-minute slots. I began working with set hours, regular clients, a clear standard. And for the first time since I had arrived in that country, I felt stability. Not the comfortable kind of stability that makes you stop, but the kind that gives you a foundation to grow. And it was at this point that I made another important decision. I didn't want to grow alone. The work was increasing. I could no longer take on all the requests. And as much as a part of me wanted to keep controlling everything, I knew that if I didn't change, I would limit myself. So I did something that, months earlier, would have seemed impossible. I started bringing other people in to work with me. At first, it was difficult. Trust doesn't come easily, especially when you built everything from scratch, with effort, with sacrifice. But I remembered myself at the beginning, exhausted, insecure, needing an opportunity. And I decided to offer what I never had. I trained with patience. I taught not just how to clean, but how to observe, how to care, how to go beyond the basics. Not everyone stayed. Some didn't adapt, others gave up. But those who stayed grew alongside me. And suddenly, something that began with me alone, cleaning houses in silence, started becoming something bigger. I was no longer limited by my own physical time. I was building something that could continue, even without me being everywhere at once. And that's when the change became truly visible, not just to me, but to everyone. The photos started showing more. The places became different. The trips started happening. Nothing excessive, but enough to completely shatter the image people had created of me. That woman who was going to clean white people's houses and come back defeated no longer existed. And along with that change, more messages came. Only now, without disguise. Direct, curious, some even desperate. "Anita, help me get there too. Can you teach me what you did? Is there a way I can work with you?" And among all those messages were the ones who, one day, had laughed. And I read every single one, without rushing to respond, and without rushing to forget, because I didn't forget, not the laughter, not the doubt, not the way they made me feel small. But I didn't carry it as a burden either. I turned it into fuel, and in that moment, I understood something that changed everything inside me. Success is not about showing others that you made it. It's about no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. And even with all of this happening, there was still a part of the story that nobody knew completely. Not even those who were now asking for help. Because what truly made the difference wasn't luck. It wasn't one specific moment. It was something deeper, something that almost nobody is willing to do. And it's exactly that, which explains why many people start, but few actually manage to turn things around. If you met me today, you might think it all happened quickly, that I got lucky, that I found the right people at the right time and simply took advantage of it. That's how most stories seem, when you only see the result. But the truth is different. What changed my life wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern of choices I repeated every single day, especially when nobody was watching. Because what almost nobody understands is that the turning point doesn't happen when things go right. It begins when you keep going, even when nothing seems to be working. There were days I woke up tired before I even got out of bed. Days when my body ached so much it felt like I wouldn't make it through another house. Days when the silence weighed more than the work itself. And even so, I continued. Not because I was strong all the time, but because I decided not to stop. And that decision, simple, repeated every day, was what built everything. The people who message me today want a quick answer. How did you do it? What did you do differently? What was the secret? They expect something direct, a step-by-step guide, a formula they can copy. But when I think about my story, there isn't one single moment that explains everything. There is a combination. Learning when it was easier to rest, saving when it was easier to spend, improving when nobody was demanding it, believing when nobody else believed. That was it. And I know that's not the answer most people want to hear, because it's not comfortable, it's not quick, and most importantly, it's not visible in the beginning. You do all of this, and for a long time, nothing changes on the outside. That's where most people give up, because it looks like it's not working. But it is, just in silence, exactly the way it happened with me. While people laughed, nothing seemed to change. While I cleaned houses, nothing seemed impressive. While I studied alone, saved money, tested, failed, there was no visible result. But there was construction. And construction takes time. Today, when someone who doubted me shows up wanting to know how to do the same, I don't feel anger, but I don't romanticize it either, because I know that what they're seeing now is the easy part, the beautiful part. They don't truly want the process. They want the ending. And that's why, for a long time, I didn't respond to those messages, not out of pride, but because I knew that any simple answer would be incomplete. Until one day, I decided to reply to one of them. It was from a woman I had known for years. She had laughed at me, not cruelly, but enough to leave a mark. She wrote, "Anita, tell me the truth. Is it worth it?" I stared at that question for a long time, because deep down, it wasn't about money. It wasn't about the United States. It was about starting over, about accepting that you have to begin at the bottom, about facing the judgment and continuing anyway. And I replied with the most honesty I had. It is, but not in the way you're thinking. I waited a few minutes and added, it's worth it if you're willing to be ignored before you're respected. It's worth it if you accept doing whatever it takes before you get to choose. It's worth it if you keep going, even when nobody is applauding. After that, she didn't reply, and I understood. Not everyone is ready, and that's okay. Because this is not a story about proving something to others. It's about deciding who you want to be, even when the world has already decided for you. I don't forget where I came from. I don't forget Jaipur. I don't forget the woman I was when I boarded that plane, afraid, not knowing if I was making the right choice. And, most importantly, I don't forget the laughter. But today, it no longer carries the same weight. Because in the end, they were right about one thing. I did come to clean houses. They were just completely wrong about the rest, because it was exactly there, doing what seemed small, that I built something nobody could have predicted. Something that wasn't born from special talent, nor from the perfect opportunity, but from decision, from consistency, from not giving up when it would have been so much easier to stop. And perhaps that's what bothers people the most. Not the fact that I made it, but the fact that I made it starting from exactly the place they used to laugh at me. Today, when people ask me how I did it, I could talk about strategies, decisions, opportunities. But deep down, it all comes down to one choice I made back at the beginning, alone, without applause, without any guarantee. I decided never to go back to being the same woman who boarded that plane. And after that, I never stopped.